Although I and the other teachers filmed for this course are all college professors, we want to emphasise that we're talking about teaching more broadly. For some people it's a profession, but nearly everyone else from time to time has to do teaching of some kind. Teaching is one of the most fundamental of all human activities. As parents, among friends and at work, teaching and learning take place all the time, and an overwhelming array of research confirms that ability to teach effectively has immense benefits for individuals and for organisations. So, before going into too much detail about how to be a good teacher in more formal settings, let me spend this lecture pointing to various moments and occasions where informal but effective teaching will have obvious benefits. Every teacher has to be a good learner too, so it's worth spending some time thinking about how to cultivate effective learning habits. As I said in the first lecture, we're all tempted by laziness and procrastination. But some people find ways to overcome those traps. They also learn how to push themselves constantly beyond their comfort zones, to welcome new experiences, and to come to grips with new ideas and new approaches to familiar situations. That's what teaching and learning are all about. And history suggests that we nearly all have a terrific capacity for learning if only we can bring ourselves to take advantage of it. You'll also come to realise on reflection that, in the end, everyone has to educate himself or herself. Teachers can help, can point you in the right direction, can encourage you and guide you, but your own willingness to learn is ultimately decisive. Parents are nearly everybody's first teachers, and the better they do it, the more their children will compete advantageously in the wider world. Parents have to teach children, first of all, how to talk, walk, and take seriously the fact that there are other people in the world. Just as life's a constant battle against laziness and procrastination, so it's a constant battle against selfishness and egotism. Anyone who's raised children will agree that it's difficult to make them understand that the world has not been put there entirely for their own benefit. And as a parent, it's a wonderful moment when, for the first time, your children start acting in ways which show that they're becoming considerate of the fact that other people have got interests and have got feelings and have to be taken into consideration rather than just the ravenous selfishness with which they start out. Now, once children have mastered language, once they begin talking, they show a ravenous curiosity, insatiable about everything else. And good parents try to answer as many of the questions that their children are always asking as they can. I always think it's terribly sad to be out somewhere and to see kids asking their parents questions, especially ones which aren't purely practical, only to see the parents saying, "Oh, not now. Oh, I can't manage that now. Please be quiet." You know that the parents are often very stressed, they're overwhelmed by the number of things that are going on, but at the same time you feel very sad about it, because the more as parents you can encourage your children to ask and the more you can satisfy their curiosity, the better you're going to be able to keep that inquisitiveness alive rather than have it begin to shut down prematurely. There's an immense literature by now on the fact that learning disparities between the most favoured and the most disadvantaged children open up very early in life. Already by the age of 3, the children who enjoy a constant intellectual stimulus, principally from their parents, have drawn so far ahead of their less fortunate contemporaries that the gap is probably never going to be closed for the rest of their lives. When schools take over children's formal education, parents remain vital as moral guides and ideally as anchors of stability. Listen to a couple of students at Vanderbilt University as they reflect on the continuing value of their parents' guidance, even though they've now left home.
I think that parents can be the best teachers you have in your life because they instill in an early age in their children what it means to learn and how to learn.
Now that I'm studying human and organizational development at Vanderbilt, I've learned that your parents, how they teach you when you're a child and the values that they instill in you, affect you for the rest of your life.
My parents taught me study skills, and they also taught me the importance of learning so that I cared about it. And to this day, I want to please them, but they've taught me to please myself too by learning.
Already by the time they're starting school, children can and do learn from one another. And as they mature, opportunities for group learning increase. Of course, that's not always entirely a good thing. There's a lot of anxiety expressed by parents and teachers about the bad influence of the peer group, that sometimes children learn the very worst things from one another. And that's an incentive for homeschooling. Now, in the last few decades, homeschooling's been growing very rapidly. And I certainly think that under the right circumstances, it can be excellent. Some of the very best undergraduates I've taught at Emory have come from the homeschooling environment. But of course, it presupposes that at least one parent has got the ability to do the teaching effectively, and that the family is economically privileged enough to be able to have one parent not working outside the home. So this can only ever be something undertaken by a lucky minority. Some schools, and most colleges, take advantage of the fact that the better students can often be useful as peer tutors to the less gifted ones. And those students in turn, who have the chance to do a little bit of teaching, gain a far clearer understanding of what it is that their teachers are up against. Nearly always, the opportunity to do some teaching makes the student teacher into a better student as well, because they've started to explore the process from both sides. If you've got the job as a student of doing some teaching, and you're conscientious about it, you'll learn the material really well. That way you can explain it in more than one way if the students you're addressing don't grasp it all at once. Here's how one student from Emory, my own campus, thinks about it.
Being a teacher myself forced me to kind of grasp a better understanding of the concepts that I was teaching and that I had learned previously.
And here's another one, talking about what the experience of teaching taught her. She suddenly realized that different students have different abilities, and that she had to engage all of them despite those differences.
It's definitely a daunting task, I would have to say, because you are responsible for increasing the knowledge of these students and increasing that passion and fire to learn. I understand what it's like to have a group of students who are on different levels, who have a different learning ability and learning style, and trying to teach the same concept to them in one lecture period.
So finding different ways to explain something which the students don't get it straight away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say that the person who really learns most from a class is the teacher.
I would have to agree, definitely. I definitely learned a lot more from teaching the SAT course.
Often it's only when you start teaching that you realize that you've got a great disparity of ability levels in the class, and that somehow you've got to be able to communicate with all of them and to make sure that you don't leave some students out in the cold. Small group work at the college level is often a useful prelude to cooperative learning at work later on in life. We filmed a biology class at Duke University as we were preparing this course, in which the students, after reading a section of Charles Darwin's great classic On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection, broke up into small groups to discuss various aspects of it. This is a fairly standard teaching technique at all levels, and it's certainly one that's been vindicated by experience. Barbara Davis, who's the author of Tools for Teachers, remarks in this way about group learning. She says, "Students learn best when they're actively involved in the process. Researchers report that, regardless of the subject matter, students working in small groups tend to learn more of what is taught and retain it longer than when the same content is presented in other instructional formats. Students who work in collaborative groups also appear more satisfied with their classes." So that's a strong endorsement of the idea of group learning, small group learning. Group work out of class also teaches students the value of organising meetings, how we're going to get together to make this thing work, discussing complex issues without the presence of a teacher, and in some cases also giving them the added stimulus of competing against one another.
I try to create projects where I feel like they will come out of it richer for it, and so that's why tests are only a small fraction of the overall picture. There have to be hands-on projects or papers, or other sorts of assignments, including competition. I will have teams working on something where they then have to present, and they're being judged relative to one another, because the business world ultimately is about competition.
And do you grade on a curve so that they're competing against each other within the class?
I do.
So it's impossible for everyone in the class to get an A or everyone to get a B. There's always going to be better and less good.
I tell them that that's the marketplace in which they will compete as managers, and so thus that's the way it is in my classroom.
In the workplace, clear communication and energetic teaching of new skills and concepts are vital parts of management. A great deal of education, of course, goes on in every workplace. Teamwork is central to today's complex business activities. Implicitly, you're doing many things at once. You're teaching information, and you're teaching a style of thinking, and you're teaching people how to cooperate. Those are some of the many benefits of group work. After college, as adults begin to specialize by profession, they often lose the breadth that their earlier education had fostered. At worst, they know more and more about less and less as they become more and more hyper-specialized. Continuing education is particularly important in these circumstances, not least to help people glimpse different ways of seeing the world. And once again, Professor Roberto from Bryant University has an insight into this kind of issue because he works not only as a college professor, but also as a consultant to corporations, so that sometimes his audience is students and sometimes it's working business people. Tell us about the different ways in which you address groups of business clients as opposed to students.
It's a different environment. Obviously, there are people with a lot more expertise and very specific expertise in a particular domain or industry. I'm typically working with them often in leadership development programs. Companies have identified high potential employees or executives who they want to help further their development. I'm going in and I'm giving them some education, but I'm also really working with them much more in applying the knowledge or ideas to their business problems and helping them think through that. So in that role, I'm not the expert anymore, right? Because in the particular domain, they're the expert. With the executives, you have to take a very different stance. Now your job is to draw out their expertise and help them use their experiences to further develop their understanding and knowledge about certain concepts and frameworks and ideas. And so the ability to draw upon their expertise and use it to leverage, create a great learning opportunity, that's very different. The students, undergraduate students, they have no body of expertise or experience from which to draw. They have a much more limited one. And so your job is to provide it to them.
And do you find that the executives, as they've become more specialized in a particular industry, have tended to forget certain insights or experiences to which the students are more alert?
Well, that's for sure. I mean, there's no question that once we spend a long time in a particular domain, blinders get put on, and we become caught in the sort of conventional wisdom of that particular business. And sometimes that means that we're not open to new ideas, whereas that undergraduate is totally open to new ideas and is scanning the whole business environment. They're trying to figure out what career they want. They may be a lot more open.
You probably heard there, Professor Roberto refers to the conventional wisdom. This is an idea, a phrase coined by John Kenneth Galbraith, the economist, to talk about the way in which we tend to start thinking about certain things in certain ways. And particularly within a particular profession, we get set in our ways. Now, there's usually a very good reason for the conventional wisdom because it develops gradually in response to experiences. But at the same time, it excludes points as well. And the job of consultants, and sometimes the job of teachers, is to challenge it and to remind people that the conventional wisdom isn't the only wisdom and that they need to start looking at things from a slightly different vantage point. As we'll see repeatedly throughout the course, the ability to adapt to new audiences is vital. Teaching is never merely a matter of conveying information. It's absolutely not a matter of standing in front of a group of people and pouring information into their heads like pouring water out of a bucket and into a series of glasses. Rather, teaching is always a matter of establishing rapport with your audience, whoever they may be, and trying to induce them to start thinking in a new way. The capacity for self-criticism is essential for professional improvement among teachers as among all people. It's very tempting at a certain point to start thinking, I know it now, I know enough. Lifelong learners resist that feeling, even if it threatens their sense of professional mastery. Here's a medical student at Vanderbilt reflecting on the pressure he feels not to admit a lack of knowledge, and the importance also of overcoming the temptation to convince himself that he already knows enough.
To be a lifelong learner, there's certain things that I think are imperative. One is that you're able to know when you don't know something, when you need to say, I need to consult the books. And it can be tough to do that, especially in a culture where there are certain norms and people just do things and you've been taught to do it a certain way. And asking that question can be very difficult. But being a lifelong learner sort of, it implies that you must. I mean, you must hit the books at times and sort of look at a problem in a new way.
Now, it's worth going back once more here to Professor Roberto, who, as a business teacher, faces a special dilemma. Isn't there a danger that he'll teach students about the business world as it is now, only to have them enter a world that's changing so rapidly that the knowledge they've acquired will quickly become obsolete? Or, to put it another way, how does he make sure that he's working to create lifelong learners? Do you think you're mainly teaching the students a body of knowledge, or are you mainly teaching them a way of thinking?
Certainly, I think I lean toward way of thinking. There are certain facts you need to know, right? There's a certain body of knowledge that you do need to know. I think it's a mistake for us to believe that we're only teaching them a way of thinking and that facts don't matter, because I think facts do matter. And there's actually research now in the field of learning that shows that having some base body of knowledge is actually conducive to developing higher level critical thinking skills. So I don't think we can abandon one in the form of the other. But I think ultimately we want to teach them a way of thinking. In the field of business, for example, there are many things that become obsolete. Pieces of body of knowledge that become obsolete, and the way of thinking is what keeps you going, allows you to then apply and deal with new environments and new issues in business. So we don't want to sort of have them only learn about sort of what matters today in the field of business. We need to prepare them to be lifelong learners who can then deal with crises and ambiguities 20 years from now.
Now, you might think that I, as a history teacher, have to worry about that problem much less. But actually, events and trends in the rapidly changing world force even historians to keep on thinking in new ways about old events. There's a dialogue between the present and the past that the best historians are all acutely aware of. For example, in the 1960s and 70s, the women's movement began, feminism, and it challenged conventional ways of thinking about the proper relationship between men and women and the roles they play in the world. As it developed, feminists who were also historians started realizing, yes, that's got enormous implications for how we understand gender relations in the past as well. And suddenly the whole new field of women's history opened up as imaginative feminist historians began challenging the conventional gender wisdom which had been applied previously to the relationships of men and women in the past. The same thing is true of the environmental movement. It set off the field of environmental history. The same thing's true of the civil rights movement. It forced a radical rethinking of race relations, both as they were in America in the 50s and 60s, and as they should be thought about now in the history of things like slavery and Reconstruction and so on. So there's a dialogue between past and present, which means that even historians have to keep alert to what's going on now, as well as knowing about the past. Mary Ellen Weimer makes a general point in her book, Learner-Centered Teaching, which I should read to you now. She says, so much knowledge exists now that it's impossible to teach students everything they need to know about anything. They must be able to continue learning after their formal education experience ends. Learning will be a lifetime experience for our students. The net effect of the expansion and evolution of knowledge is that learning will be a much more important aspect of professional life than in the past. Students need to graduate from college knowing as much about learning content as they know about the content itself. In other words, it's not enough simply to introduce your students to a body of knowledge. You've got to teach them how to think about that knowledge and how to be creative in putting it together in new ways as the actual circumstance of the world in which they live keeps on changing. This is another point that we're going to come back to throughout this course. I have to teach students not just plenty of history, although I do that, I've also got to teach them to think historically. What I mean by that is that when they first encounter history as high school or grade school students, they often learn that certain people in history were good, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and certain other people were bad, the slave owners, for example, or Adolf Hitler. Now, actually, thinking historically means that you've got to get beyond those kinds of simple stereotypes. You've got to start taking seriously the idea that When conflicts develop in history, it's not because good people come up against bad people. It's because people with different ideas about what's right come into conflict with each other. And one thing I often say to my own students is, history isn't the struggle of right against wrong. It's the struggle of right against right. You're not going to be able to understand the history of American slavery, for example, unless you pay equal attention to the ideas of the slave owner and to the ideas of the slaves and to the ideas of the abolitionists. You need to get into each group's shoes in turn and understand how they looked at it and then explain why they came into conflict. It's not enough to take the side of the group you happen to favour now and fulminate on their behalf. That's not really historical writing at all. In exactly the same way, students, when they're being introduced to science beyond a fairly elementary level, have to start thinking in accordance with the scientific method. And that means that they have to learn, for example, that anecdotes aren't good enough. It may be true that now and again we can encounter incidents, but they only become scientifically significant when you can do a controlled experiment where the same thing happens again and again, or if it's a social science experiment where you've got a statistically significant number of people involved in the experiment itself. Students have to start learning about the importance of the control group, a group of people to whom nothing happens, who at first glance seem to be completely irrelevant, but whom you gradually realise are vital, so that you can be sure that the difference between the experimental group and the control group is what's decisive. If you didn't have the control group, you wouldn't know whether the experiment itself had caused the change or whether that was something that was going to happen in any case. So in other words, every discipline has got its own characteristic way of thinking. There's a historical method, there's a scientific method, and there's a method in each of the other disciplines. And that's what you introduce students to, in addition to the nuts and bolts, the actual material through which is then going to be interpreted by those methods. Now, these styles are nearly always counter-instinctual. Throughout their lives, most people, as they continue to read history, don't really get into the shoes of the different actors. Popular history writing doesn't encourage them to do so. Scientists don't often get into the or popular science writers don't always get into the statistical significance. They're content with anecdotes, which are far more fun to read about. So moving beyond the general sense to the special sense, that's what we have to do as teachers. We have to introduce the students to thinking in specialized ways. Growing numbers of adult and retired Americans are enjoying educational opportunities today and looking for greater intellectual stimulation. This was the insight that set Tom Rollins to create the teaching company in the first place back in the year 1990. And the very fact that you're watching this lecture now suggests that it was a good idea that worked. He could see that there were large numbers of people, particularly adults now involved in their professional careers and people retired, who would like to know a lot more information than they had the opportunity to glean when they were college students, at which time they had imperative career needs and couldn't spend as much time as they might like to on philosophy or history or music. And now he's given many of them the opportunity. Do you ever wonder whether there isn't a limit to how much you can learn? I think the answer is no. There is no limit. Learning is cumulative, and your capacity to learn more increases with more knowledge rather than decreasing. Think about professional actors. They say, at first it's hard to learn a part, but when you've learned one, it's a bit easier to learn the next one, and the next one's a bit easier still, and then you can go on learning parts more or less indefinitely. Concert pianists who have to play entirely from memory. At first, learning those solos is difficult, but you become accustomed to doing it, and your capacity increases as you do it more. Hence the paradox that the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. Sometimes an author's or a teacher's stray remark can disclose to you an entire realm of ideas or experience about which you'd previously been completely and blissfully unaware. This is a comment on that situation from Barbara Davis. She says, learning is an active, constructive process that is contextual. New knowledge is acquired in relation to previous knowledge. Information becomes meaningful when it's presented in some type of framework. Again, I think that's absolutely right. For me, it's relatively easier to assimilate new historical information because I've already got the historian's conceptual framework, whereas for me, it's much more difficult to learn in physics because I lack the basic conceptual framework within which to fit subsequent pieces of information. Let me come back now to a point I made at the beginning. Although good teachers can help a very great deal and can inspire their students to become lifelong learners, in the end, the initiative has to come from the student. The student has got to want to learn and has got to be willing to actually do the hard work, or else it's just never going to happen. In one way or another, we're only going to be fully educated if we educate ourselves. Ultimately, that's what our goal should be for our students too. That we should cause them to want to educate themselves and then give them the tools to do it. Obviously, at its best, we're inspiring the students. We're showing them, look at the kind of life we lead. Our lives are devoted to learning more and then to passing on what we've learned to others. And it's very rich and rewarding. Very often we can spark in them the understanding of what an opportunity it is and enable them to get started in doing it. So now let me sum up this lecture. First of all, there's an intimate and symbiotic relationship between learning and teaching. Therefore, we should give as many of our students as possible the opportunity to teach others because they'll learn so much from it. Second, teachers need to be first-rate learners, and learners need to learn how to teach themselves. We live in a world which has created many new incentives for us to become lifelong learners and has given us far more opportunities than ever before. Luckily, lifelong learning is a pleasure. We've never had more resources to help us do it than we have now. Third, we nearly all have to be teachers of some kind at various stages in our lives. Many of us as parents, sometimes among our peers, at schools and at work. If you're in a business environment, encourage employees who have special skills or training to be available as a training or support resource for other employees. Now, I believe that the benefits of teaching well will be both practical and psychological. Everyone who's learning something feels mentally stimulated and stretched. And when you're teaching something for the first time, although it's challenging, it's also very, very gratifying. In the next lecture, we'll move on from here to consider good ways of teaching your first class or your first meeting with a group of learners, and about the importance of making the right kind of first impression.